I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Friends of Fondren Library for joining us at our annual reception to honor rights authors, editors, composers, and artists. My name is Caldwell. I'm Professor of History. My co-chair for this event is Professor Julie Fette, who's also my good friend, if I may say that. And she's in French studies. Her teaching, her research extends from children's literature to the history of race and difference in Vichy to the study of women and gender. We'd like to welcome all the members and all the guests to tonight's event. I will say others were going to come, but it turns out, as you know, the Houston people are hardy people when it's under 40 degrees. So, it was a very important day finally, wasn't it? So tonight we're going to honor those members of the rights community who have contributed published works to the arts, sciences, and humanities in 2023. And after recognizing each honoree, we'll introduce our panelists for the evening, and Professor Fette will moderate the discussion of the theme for the evening. Now, I apologize for standing behind here, but this is the way to actually move the screen forward and backward. I'm not hiding from you, I promise. So, the topic for tonight is shaking it up in literature, pedagogy, and politics, which ought to be an interesting one. We're gonna, after that discussion, we'll open up the floor to questions and answers from the audience, insofar as there's time. And so that's the battle plan for the evening. Then we'll wrap things up, and there will be a nice reception with enough food for about 20 more people that are here. So if you were graduate students, you'd be in good shape. Okay, so now we're going to recognize our honorees, which is one of the most interesting times of the evening. And a lot of times there are people here I've known for years, I didn't know they were working on a book, and suddenly a book appears. Jose Aranda, The Places of Modernity in Early Mexican American Literature. John Bowles, We'll Never Stop Publishing, right? 7 Virginians, The Men Who Shaped Our Republic. So I'm looking forward to reading. Dominic Boyer has come out with his book, No More Fossils. Justin Cronin, the novel, The Ferryman. Elizabeth Crook, The Gnatstone, a novel. April DeConnick is a book out on comparing Christianities, which is an introduction to early Christianity. Ugochi Imanaha has a revised version of Beautiful, which is winner of the Multicultural Children's Publication Award from the National Association for Multicultural Education. Jackie Fisher has published The Growth Paradox, Rethinking Control, Accountability, and Change to Move Your Business to the Next Level. Gernot Gobel has written on Theodor Storm, Der kleine Hebelmann. Sadly, no image of that. Christine Gollop, I believe, Ertanai, the Knights of the Dagger series, I believe. Ron Goldman has published on dual quaternions and their associated Clifford algebras. Our author here on stage, Rosemary Hennessy, has published a long-awaited book, which I've started reading and enjoying a lot, in the company of radical women writers. And next to her, Emily Hulick-Ritchie, calling I only met this year, believe it or not, Imagining Iberia in English and Castilian medieval romance. Simony Howe, with others, has written on solarities, elemental encounters, and refractions. It's an edited volume. Betty Joseph has published a book, From Empire to Anthropocene, the Novel in Post-Historical Times. Alexander Juden, Crossing Darkness, one of the mystery series that he's been working on. Carlos Kelly, Ready Player One, Latinx masculinities and stereotypes in video games. Anne Klein, Being Human and a Buddha Too, Long Chen Pa's 7 Trainings for a Sunlit Sky. Alex Glynn Latner, Adversary. Sin T. Lee, with Andrew Birch, her Field Guide to North American Flycatchers. Impinomax and Peewees. That's someone from a state that has a flycatcher as their state bird, I honor this book. Antonios Mikos with Joanna Temanov, Biomaterials, the intersection of biology and materials sciences. Timothy Morton, The Stuff of Life. Taylor Nelson, an essay, Laboring Bodies, Work Animals, and Hack Writers in Oliver Goldsmith's Letters in the Body, 1700 to 1830, Writing and Embodiment. Robert Patton, Dickens' Death and Christmas. Leif Peterson Ford, a screenplay. Anthony Pinn with Brad Braxton, a masterclass on being human. A Black Christian and Black secular humanist on religion, race, and justice. It's gotten some attention. Brian Washington, new novel, Family Meal. Kelly Weinersmith, A City on Mars. Can we settle space? Should we settle space? And have we really thought this through? I guess the answer is no. I should have been crying. Natalie Manning Wolf, writing as Manning Wolf, Hunted by Proxy, a lawyer on the run, action suspense thriller. Anne-Marie Womack, with Lauren Garden, Inclusive College Classrooms, Teaching Methods for Diverse Learners. I will say in preparation for this, I read an article on excluding the Peterson classroom, which I disagreed with in a very constructive way. So, very interesting work, looking forward to it. Pat Barnes-Ricks, writing as Patricia Wynn, Poetic Justice, a Blue Satan Mystery. Elias Bomba with Robert Manziger, Philosophy, Freedom, Language, and Their Others, Contemporary Legacies of German Idealism. Stephen DeLay, Life Above the Clouds, Philosophy in the Films of Terrence Malick. Ilana Gershon with Yasmin Musharbash, Living with Monsters, Ethnographic Fiction about Real Monsters. Matthias Hensel with David Lincicco, Israel's Scriptures and Early Christian Writings, the Use of the Old Testament in the New. It's an edited volume. Anthony Pinn with Darrell Jones and Lanifa Love, the collected writings of William R. Jones, Speculations on Black Life. Again, Anthony Pinn. To Speak a Defined Word, Holly Murray's Sermons and Speeches on Justice and Transformation. Ragini Charur, Srinivasan, with others, Thinking with an Accent toward a New Object, Method, and Practice. Kyle Sweeney, with Alice Isabella Sullivan, Lateness and Modernity in Medieval Architecture. And now we'll turn to errors. I just want to say that was one of the longest lists of books I read in the 8 years or so I've been doing this. So I think all of us have a lot of work to do coming here, right? Just think about here. We're going to talk about people engaged in editing. Tony Morrow is, of course, continues to edit Positions, Asia Critique. Logan Browning, I'm not sure I saw him here today. SEL, Studies in English Literature, 1500 to 1900. Jacqueline Kuti, a special issue of Journal of Women's History. Debo and Dinter, Standing Up and Determined, Black Women on the Move, Black Feminism in French Post-Imperial Contexts. Daniel Dominguez, in my department, Slavery, this is an annual biographical supplement of slavery and abolition. Christian Emden, in editing Nietzsche's Studien. Brett Ashley Leeds, editing International Organizations. Antonios Mikos, Journal of Tissue Engineering. And Michael Wong, the ACS Environmental Science and Technology Engineering Department. We'll turn now to several recent exhibitions. Our friend Nasha Bowden, Sundogs, and Christopher Sperandio. This year is next year is last year. And we had him here last time. Julie was with us, a couple years ago. Aaron along, The Chosen Ones. We'll turn to music, pardon me. Bart Gottschalk in the front row. Litany. Bart also produced Loser. The Wit and Wisdom of Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States of America. Appreciate the neutral commentary. Patricia Reif and Carolyn Summers, Totality Over Texas, which was a planetarium show, pardon me. And translation, Cinema of the Soviet Thought, Space Materiality Movement by Lida Gorojova, was translated into Russian. Timothy Norton has recorded an audio version of his book, The Stuff of Life. And there'll be a movie made out of Peterson's Ford, the screenplay. So, an amazing group. Thank you for Mary and others for putting this together. Amazing group. Let's thank all the authors, alums, students, professors who've done this. Okay, we're going to move now to the panel discussion. And for this, I would like to yield the floor to my colleague, Julie Fette, who will moderate the discussion. Julie?
Thank you, Carl. Welcome, everyone, and especially welcome to my fine panelists. To my immediate left is Emily Hulick-Ritchie. After that is Rosemary Hennessy, and then Anne-Marie Womack. So it's a pleasure to have all of you here to discuss shaking things up. So I'll start with Emily. First question. Your book shakes up the way medieval literature is done. And so I wonder if you could explain to us how your approach to English and Castilian romance reorients not just the canon, which is a lot, but it also aims to reorient academic disciplinary practices in medieval studies. So if you could talk to us about that kind of shaking up.
I've scripted answers so that they are more coherent. So in this book, I comparatively analyze shared story traditions in English and Castilian and sometimes Portuguese romances that are set in whole or in part or in Iberia, which is a catch-all term I use for the Iberian Peninsula, more or less, called many different things in the medieval period. So I'm analyzing romances that share the same plotline, but that do not share the direct relation of source and adaptation. So methodologically, that's different. Romances standing in this neighboring relation to each other have rarely been comparatively studied. It's usually source and adaptation, if they're that closely related on the same plotline. So this approach takes us outside the realm and scope of traditional narrative pairings and languages that have traditionally dominated the field of medieval studies when we do comparative literature. So many Middle English romances, for instance, are adaptations of French romances. So you see lots of Middle English French comparative studies. And for example, some of Chaucer's romances are adaptations of Boccaccio's work, so you see those kinds of pairings. Rather than English and Castilian, which generally are not texts that are related to each other directly in that way. So the Castilian romances, in addition to this, are traditionally understudied, even in Castilian medieval studies. Alan Daverman is one of the sort of famous medieval Spanish medievalists, famously called them the lost genre of medieval Spanish literature. And outside that realm of Spanish medieval studies, they are virtually ignored. So in one commonly taught collection of retellings of narratives of the downfall of Troy in the medieval world, you get Latin texts, and you get Italian texts, and you get French texts, and you get Middle English texts. The Castilian texts, which do exist, are not included, and I don't think they're even mentioned in that volume's introduction, as wonderful and useful as it is in many ways. So it's worth redressing this lack, I think, because we see the canon of Middle English romances very differently when we set them alongside the Castilian counterparts that we're less familiar with. And one of the examples I like best of this from the book is the story of Flore and Blanchefleur. And in the Middle English and French versions, which are the ones mostly studied, there's the character Flore, or Florus in Middle English, has a moment when he has to pursue his beloved Blanchefleur, who's been enslaved, and he disguises himself as a merchant to go and do this, to travel around and try to get her back. In the Middle English, or in the medieval Castilian version of this romance, he doesn't disguise himself at all. He just goes as himself and takes an army with him, because he and his family are just as powerful, and he has this clout on his own terms to be welcomed in all these other courts around the Mediterranean without needing to have a kind of disguise. And this being something that is not normally studied, especially with this tradition, I looked at that and I thought, what is it doing in that romance when he disguises himself as a merchant? Like, what is that? What is that representational choice actually doing? Which is not a question I don't think I would have thought to examine in that way if I hadn't been looking at the two versions, these particular two versions together. And of course, then the payoff, the kind of argument that you build when you're doing source adaptation study is often an argument about influence or transmission. So the argument that you build, if you're looking at texts where that's off the table, they're related, but it's not a story of transmission or influence. So it's really a story of the kind of reciprocal light each text can shed on the other by virtue of bringing them together. And so you're concluding things. I'm concluding things about the romances kind of on their own terms, but that were elucidated by the act of comparison.
Thank you, Emily. We'll get back to neighborly texts in a minute. Anne-Marie Womack, if you mind, will you tell us what your book proposes about shaking it up in the 21st century college classroom?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited to be on the panel with Emily and Rosemary as well. So I co-authored Inclusive College Classrooms with Lauren Cardin, who is my former colleague, but current friend, and she's from the University of Alabama. We hope this book shakes things up by encouraging instructors to think about who is included in our teaching. Who are we teaching to and for in college classrooms? Traditionally, higher education has focused mostly on students who perform well. These students are envisioned as the best and the brightest, so scholars study their habits and then encourage other students to just act more like them, follow those best practices. And from this perspective, if you focus on the best, and everyone benefits. And certainly there are a lot of things we learn by studying high-performing students. But what about students who don't fit our models because their identities, abilities, and communities have never really been included in this vision? Historically, and continuing today, research shows academia excludes students based on race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and citizenship, and all the different ways that these categories overlap, as well as many others. So our book suggests a different approach. To us, inclusive teaching supports learning and belonging for all students by centering students who have been systemically marginalized. In other words, we focus on excluded students as a way to benefit everyone. For example, many courses require class participation. One way to include disabled students is to offer a choice in how students participate. So a student might speak aloud, or they might write ideas on a note card and hand them to the professor, or they might post an online forum. Offering choices and integrating multiple forms of communication can really help everyone. It can build a dynamic classroom with higher participation from a lot of students and make us look a little different. There are multiple examples from disability culture that show how being flexible and really thinking about difference in the classroom and in technology and in spaces can benefit many, many more people. For example, these are my two favorites. The typewriter was developed for and with a blind woman, and texting was developed in collaboration with the deaf community. And obviously that's transformed the way many of us communicate, regardless of disability. Let's consider one more aspect of inclusive teaching, representation. I'm going to give an example of just one instance of how racism affects the teaching of medicine. Multiple studies show that dark skin tones are not represented in medical textbooks. That means many doctors are not adequately prepared or trained to recognize skin conditions on Black and brown skin, unless they have a professor who's thinking inclusively and make sure to supplement the textbook with different pictures. So here, better representation can lead to better doctors. These are just two quick examples to illustrate the main message of our book that we hope shakes things up. Inclusive teaching is effective teaching, and effective teaching is inclusive teaching.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And now I will turn to Rosemary. Please tell us about the radical women writers that you chose to study. Who are they, and what kind of shaking up did they do?
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, all of you, for being here. All 7 of the writers in my book were young women writers in the 1930s, Depression years. Like many others in that time, they confronted the fatal costs of capitalism and learned that there could be a more equitable way for human needs to be met. Each carried her political education during the 1930s into the dark time of the Cold War years of the 50s. All of them were inspired by American communism, and each expanded its scope. I organized their contributions into 3 parts: labor, land, and love, areas that characterize their radical attention to neglected yet necessary life-supporting relations. 4 of them were from Harlem and wrote about Black women's domestic labor. Marlo Cook was a journalist who wrote about the Black women who were waiting on corners around the city, hoping to be hired for a pittance to work for a day or several days, cleaning or cooking. Louise Thompson Patterson spotlighted Black mothers in her coordination of national support for the Scottsboro Boys. These were 9 Black teenage men falsely accused in 1931 of raping 2 white women in Alabama. Alice Childress wrote newspaper columns and turned them into a novel that features the dramatic monologue of a savvy Black domestic worker. Claudia Jones held top positions in the U.S. Communist Party and took the party to task for its neglect of Negro women's labor. She went to federal prison in the 1950s under the McCarran and Smith Acts and was deported for her political views. In centering Black women's domestic labor in their writing, these women laid the groundwork for some of the most significant contributions to feminist thought. Their attention to Black women's hyper-exploitation would not become the central claim of Black feminism for almost 50 years. 2 white women from the U.S. Midwest, Josephine Herbst and Mary Delaceur, reckoned with their settler colonial heritage in their writing as it shaped their relationship to the land and their lived experience of whiteness. Herbst and Delaceur recognized that the division between humans and nature is itself a historical product. They knew that capital accumulation fundamentally depends on a relation to the land and its resources that support the reproduction of life. both witnessed that dependence broken in the destruction of the prairie grasslands during the Great Dust Bowl in the 1930s. They bore witness to farmer strikes and the displacement of Native people by generations of settlement, a legacy both women confronted in their writing. Uriel Rukeyser was Jewish and grew up on the Upper West Side of New York City. Her archived papers offered me a backdrop of sorts to her attention to the erotic life of race and racism. And I turned to them in my book's final chapter. Her diaries and poems from the 1930s document her trips south, where she daringly addressed the erotic intensities of race work. Rukeyser was involved in the Scottsboro campaign. She attended the second trial of Haywood Patterson in 1933 and wrote about the case in terms that focused on working class women's reproductive and affective labor. In closing, I'll just add that writing this book opened for me, as I hope it will for readers, a pivotal historical moment when the Reds were seen as people to summon when you needed help. People whose community meetings held out the possibility of a way of life not based on competition and greed. I also hope the book restores a group of women writers to their rightful place as public intellectuals in the best sense, thinkers and organizers who shook things up by broadening and advancing the insights of a political philosophy they understood to be vital to the continued reproduction of life on planet Earth.
Thank you, Rosemary. And we will have a chance for questions from the audience, but I'll seize the moment to ask another question of our panelists. So back to Emily. You alluded to the way you look at texts as neighbors. Can you say more about that for us, please?
Yeah, so it's in the book as a whole, it's a methodological approach to comparison to get outside source and adaptation, traditional source study relationship, but nor am I doing comparison on texts that are not part of the same plot line, but simply share some sort of feature, because that kind of work does get done. So there's a whole set of different plots in the medieval world of women who are floating around the ocean in boats with no rudders for at least part of the story, and they're not all the same story. And so there's comparative work on that. And those are not source studies. They're doing something else, and I wanted something different from both of those, to bring texts that are related, they're next to each other. If you drew a textual family tree with a stemma, they would both be on it, or sometimes more of them that I look at together would be on it, but they're not hierarchically directly related to each other. One's not directly coming from the other. So texts are neighbors in their non-relation as source and adaptation, and in their shared relation as part of the same overall story tradition, with having a shared plot. So again, it means it's not an argument about influence and transmission. It's not an argument that makes a claim about the text relation to each other or is based on the text relation to each other, except insofar as the juxtaposition in the act of comparison gives rise to certain insights that I think would not have arisen, at least not to me, in a different mode of comparison. So this opens up to a different conception of the world that they're describing, I think, and one of my favorite examples of this is in Middle English Romance. It's very famous. Chaucer told a version of it in Old English, and there's others. And it is one of those float in a boat with no rudder stories. And the protagonist in the boat, it goes all over. She's floating lots of different places in a boat in the story. And among these places, she briefly lands on the coast of Iberia. And then departs again rather quickly. And all the other places she lands, all the other episodes in the story are longer, more things happen in those episodes, they're more developed. And so for the Middle English tradition, and one of those places that's more developed is actually England or Northumberland. So for Middle English romance, that's been considered a very significant episode, presumably for the authors and the audiences of the romances. And the Iberian episode, I think because brief, and because it's not parallel to one of the other episodes the way some of them are. So in two of those different episodes, you have a marriage plot, one that doesn't come off and one that does. The husband is a non-Christian in both cases. There's conversion in both the cases. There's an angry mother-in-law or prospective mother-in-law in both cases, and there's an exile of the protagonist in Rudderless in both cases. So in those two episodes, it's very clearly should be read in light of each other. They're so analogous. The Iberian episode, being short, doesn't have most of those features. And so it's been kind of left out of the accounting, not in terms of that it doesn't happen, but just in terms of what the significance of the place, Iberia, is doing in that story. But it turns out that one of the Middle English versions went to the Iberian Peninsula, went to Portugal, and it was translated into Portuguese. And then the Portuguese version was translated into Castilian during the medieval period. And so in comparing originally the Castilian version with the Middle English version, which you're skipping in middle one in that initial comparison to how I started that work, I was thinking, well, for the Iberian authors, that Iberian episode might be more significant in terms of the fact that it's in Iberia, that specific place. And so again, that led me to a reconsideration of what I think the Iberian episode is doing in all the versions, and the significance of the fact that it is Iberia, where she's briefly landing and then leaving. So the neighborly comparison, again, sort of changes in my readings of the book. It changes the way I think the romances are setting up the world to, in this case, exclude Iberia, because it really just gets cut out of all the networks, of all the places in that story. It's the only one that doesn't come into the Roman Empire by the end. And I think that that's a significant detail that just hasn't been considered as such in traditional source study outside of neighboring relation.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to Anne-Marie again. Anne-Marie, there are probably a few professors in the room, and it's still early in the semester. Could you please make some suggestions for how we can think of the classroom not as a space of a linear professor-student relationship, but more of a community, and what kind of benefits might result from that change of perspective in the classroom?
Sure. Inclusive college classrooms promote multiple kinds of community. I'm going to focus on two: community between the people in the room and community between the class and the larger world around us. To me, community is a lot about conversation, about whose voices are heard and valued in the classroom. In traditional classes, the only voice heard is the professor lecturing. And lecture can be a really great technique, certainly one I use in my class, but not exclusively. More inclusive classrooms value student voices, and there's a range of strategies to involve and engage students depending on your field and your context. It's going to look different if you have 100 students in a stadium classroom or if you have 15 students in a circle. For example, you can integrate small moments of conversation using the peer instruction technique of physicist Eric Mazur. With this method, the professor intersperses questions throughout a lecture. The professor pauses during the lecture, gives students time to answer the questions, and then they compare answers with people around them. They explain their reasoning, and if their answers differ, they're trying to convince one another. A lot of research has shown that this is a highly effective way for students to retain information and to learn their own errors in thinking. Other professors, such as feminist scholar Bell Hooks, who is now deceased, have made discussions central to their courses. They encourage students to see connections between course content and their own lives, especially their political lives. And one of the benefits is that it really demonstrates to students that lived experience is an important form of knowledge, and that learning happens in social spaces and in communities. Or you might try a collaborative experiential learning project. I really like to have students act as some type of award committee. They create an award, they outline the judging criteria, and then they judge examples from the class. So in a literature classroom, like one of y'all's, students can award a literary prize to one of the novels in the class. In an engineering design class, because I work with engineers and as a part of engineering communication, students could award an imaginary grant to a school project. In a business class, students can function as a hiring committee. Experiential learning really goes far in embedding students in environments and activities that they would do in the world outside academia. We cover all of these examples and hundreds more in our book, but in general, engaging learners and cultivating more community leads to greater attention, critical thinking, and class performance. Community plays another key role in education that I want to talk about. Inclusive classrooms examine the relationship between the classroom and the larger world. We ask, how can our discipline help us understand and improve our communities? But in addition to that kind of optimism about what our fields can do, we have to confront the inequities inherent in our fields. All academic disciplines have harmed marginalized communities, such as people of color, women, disabled people, LGBTQIA+ people, and other communities. We see examples of oppression in the fields of business, medicine, literature, architecture, history, the list goes on. And scholars are doing important work to shed light on these and to change the conditions of how we practice research so that we honor communities outside of the university. Ultimately, in our classrooms, I think we have to continually think about whose voices are being prioritized and who we include in our communities.
Thank you. And a final question for Rosemary. What does the set of women under your microscope, what do they teach us about the American communist movement in the ways that we think we know it? How do you shape that up?
Okay, thanks, Julie, for that question. I wrote this book because I wanted to respond to the vilifying of communism and socialism in U.S. mainstream political discourse now, by writing a book that invited readers to learn something different. Drawing them into the company of these women's captivating stories seemed to me one way I might intervene in a distorted national mythology. 6 of these writers were Communist Party members. Perhaps, like some of you, I actually knew little about the extensive reach of Communist Party activities in the Depression years. I learned that the party helped organize grocery store boycotts, interrupted evictions, provided relief efforts, and set up neighborhood councils during the Great Depression long before federal relief programs arrived. I also knew nothing about the party's anti-racism campaign. Efforts to combat what they called white chauvinism took place both among party members and in a national campaign for Black self-determination. That campaign solidified in the party's defense of the Scottsboro Boys, which had widespread national and international support throughout the 30s. As Black, Jewish, or white, as immigrant or settler, these women were inspired by the party's anti-racism efforts and proceeded to advance its official stance on race. Some of them, again surprisingly for me, opened whiteness to investigation. Some, at times, did succumb to the powerful pull of race ideology that swirled around anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism then. It was notable for me, though, that the problem of race remained a through line in their lives, in large part through their affiliation with Communist Party organizations and publications. All found ways to continue writing during the repressive 1950s when they endured blacklisting, surveillance, and censorship. Invariably, they wrote with an eye to the tangled relation of race to gender, and sexuality. What was striking for me in all 7 women's writing is their expansive attention to what reproducing life requires. And in this respect, they set out to shape Americans and American communism. They invite readers to comprehend more fully what sustaining life requires, the relations of what I call life-making, in domestic labor, in human reliance on the land, and in the erotics of interdependence. This attention to the relations of life-making is what I consider the most radical feature of their writing. I wrote this book as a primer for the present. Let me explain what I mean. I drafted it during time away from teaching in 2020 and 2021, when so many of us were on COVID lockdown. It was clear to me then that what these writers had to say resonated in the world that was being redefined by the pandemic, when the precarity of life-making had become palpable. When women were summoned to shoulder domestic work that had multiplied tenfold. When the murder of George Floyd and so many other Black men and women forced a national reckoning with state-sanctioned police brutality and the weaponizing of race. And when wildfires and floods from California to China were warning that the planet's disease is approaching terminal. I invite readers to enter the company of these 7 writers in the hope that they will find, that you will find, in their compelling lives and writings, a past that is really not so long ago, or even really past, but very much still with us.
Great, thank you. And now I'll open up to some brief questions from the audience. Do you have any? Yes. You could speak loud.
The romances, it seems like you've got the same stories and variations in all these different countries. Where was the original source of the stories? Or can you even figure that out?
Sometimes we can figure that out. It might sort of always be provisionally because, I mean, the survival rate of manuscripts from that period is not impressive relative to the number we think were produced. So it's always possible we've lost things. We know we've lost things. We don't always know what we've lost. And then in other cases, sometimes the origin is just really difficult to pinpoint specifically. But most of these romance traditions have a kind of, oldest textual exemplar that we know of, that we have still, or that we have evidence of, that then we sort of work from there when we're wanting to do literary analysis, right? And work. So in the first shared story tradition that I look at is a Charlemagne romance around a character, Favrot, who is a Muslim knight who then, in the course of the narrative, converts to Christianity and joins Charlemagne's army. So it's named after him, although it's not the only thing in the story. And the sort of original, such as we could know, seems to be an old French version that then moves into several other different French versions, one of which then goes over and gets another story sort of smacked on the front, translated into Anglo-Norman, and then translated, or adapted again into Middle English, and that's one of the versions I end up looking at. There are other Middle English versions that come from a slightly different path, but out of the French tradition. And then, again, there's another path down over to get to the Spanish version that I look at in that chapter. Often, with the romances I've looked at, there is the French is as far back as we can confidently sort of trace it with an identifiable text or manuscript. But they do, it's a very mobile genre, and it's a very popular genre. And there are versions in almost any medieval language that you can name. They have versions of most of these stories. There's just so many. So thank you for the question.
Anyone? Yes.
This is for Rosemary. Is there another, you chose 7. Is there another person that you wish that you could have included, or that you decided not to include?
Well, there are lots, actually. It was very hard for me to come up with the 7, and there had to be a kind of logic, and that was what I explained to you. Just the clustering of the women that I was finding working in Harlem was interesting to me, especially around the detective work. I loved writing this book because I felt sometimes like a detective and sometimes like a spying sister reading diaries. But with the Harlem women, I speculated and actually know in some cases that they crossed paths, that they obviously knew about each other. They didn't always write about each other. Some of them did clearly work together. So that was a nice way to group them. The Midwestern grouping, I just had to stop, but Tilly Olsen is someone I would have liked to include. She was much like Muriel Lesueur. She wrote in the 1930s, but her writings were not published. Her manuscript was rejected, and like Lesueur, her work was recovered by feminists in the 1970s. And so there's much that they shared in common. She was also a Communist Party member, etc. Has a really interesting life. Sonora Babb is another Midwesterner, although what constitutes the Midwest is itself a question, as it is in Texas. Are we in the South or are we in the West? But Sonora Babb was from Colorado, and then she and her sister did really interesting work that foregrounds in a way that the other writers don't. The Dust Bowl and the Okies, who traveled to California, and she moved to California and actually married a man who was a major figure in the film industry, a cinematographer. And they both had to move to Mexico during the 50s. So she's someone I would have liked to include in her papers at the University of Texas, Austin. But you can hear how I just had to draw the line. The question around Rukeyser, it was really Rukeyser's work, her poem called the Book of the Dead. This like magisterial, amazing poem. I've never read anything like it. That includes documentary evidence and congressional committee reports and interviews with engineers. It's based on a trip that she took with a friend photographer to West Virginia to report on the hundreds of workers who were building what was supposed to be a tunnel and turned into a mine, mining silicosis, and many of them were dying or dead from, they were mining silica and they were dead from silicosis. Anyway, my question that sent me to the archives of Rukeyser was, who was the photographer? Because the figure of the photographer appears in the poem, but unnamed. And so that just unfolded a really interesting story that took me to questions around race and the erotic and the relationship between Rukeyser and the photographer that ends up, I mean, it was just such interesting detective work. It finally goes, the story goes to Alice Walker, who was a student of Rukeyser's, and Alice Walker's connections to Zora Neale Hurston, and Rukeyser's, what can I say, reaction when she learned that her student had found the grave of Zora Neale Hurston in the 1970s. So there's like all of these connections that unfolded. And so where do you stop? You know, you stop with this 50s or the 60s or Alice Walker or, yeah, so the thing about your question too is that these writers from the 30s who were young and inspired by what was in the air of the 1930s, as Josephine Park said, communism was just about what you read, who you talked to, the we that you used in your everyday. So for me, it was like, where do you stop? Because the 50s impacted all of them. And then many of them lived long lives. Mary Ellison died at 94, and she wrote her last novel when she was 90. So it was a challenge and also a kind of decision-making that writers have to make around what to include and why. But thanks for the question.
Excellent. Yes.
I have a question for Anne-Marie. How did you and your co-author go about finding, discovering these innovative, inclusive techniques and measuring their impact?
Sure. So my field of research is disability studies, and my colleagues is in cultural studies, especially race in literature. And our book collects examples from a variety of disciplines, like I said, over 200. And the principles that we are using are things that are based on the practices from disability studies, from feminist pedagogy, and from social justice pedagogies that are particularly attuned to race. So we did not run a study for the book. Instead, this is, you might think of it as a meta-analysis of what does it look like to look really holistically at inclusive methods. So not just one identity focused on, but really intersectional, all these different identities that affect how we include people in a classroom. Thanks.
So, thank you everyone, and especially thanks to our amazing panelists who shook things up for us tonight. Really just love to hear you talking about your work, and so thank you for sharing. And we have, Fondren has a gift for you. That you this weekend.
One of those gifts you can give people in Houston again, no problem, right? I want to thank everyone for coming as well. I want to say a few words though about Friends of Fondren, the organization that actually has organized this tonight. This is a membership organization that provides financial support to the Fondren Library, the beating heart of the university, right? Presents lectures and events for members and for the Rice community as well. Now, if you aren't already a member, please consider this a personal invitation to join. I don't know how many years I've been a member, because I do still consider, whether it's books or other kinds of publications or places where people convey information to each other, this is the center of the university. So that's my request to you to consider joining, if you haven't already. We hope you will join us for future Friends of Fondren Library events. We have 4 events on the calendar I'd like to mention to you. One is on January 23rd, the DeLong Conference, which will involve a speech by Jim Endersby, historian of science who specializes in the history of the life sciences. He's visiting from the University of Sussex. He will be speaking about his research, which includes the Woodson Research Center's Huxley collection. Our next Books That Shape My World lecture is with Bill Martin. Bill Martin, the Harry and Hazel Chabon Professor Emeritus of Religion and Public Policy in the Department of Sociology. And it's on February 6th. And if you've never experienced Bill, then you need to go. We're honoring Karen and Larry George in the 2024 Friends of Fondren Library Gala on March 15th. And finally, our next Meet the Author lecture is going to be on April 1st. Mary tells me to say that's not a joke. It's on April 1st, and Scott Sonnenschein will be speaking. He's the Henry Gardner Simmons Professor at the Jesse Jones School of Business. He wrote Stretch and co-wrote Joy at Work, Organizing Professional Life with Mary Conwell. Now, you're going to receive information about this from Mary if you've given her your email. And I just wanted to warn you about that. I also want to make clear that we need to give Mary a round of applause for all the work she's done. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for coming. It's a really nice flyer if you want to join, right outside the room. And I invite you all to come to our reception. Thank you very much.